of Colonies, Cannibals and Vernaculars, an essay by Susan Bassnett and Harish Trivedi. Now, the entire essay opens up with a narration of an event which happened in the 16th century in Brazil, where the members of a tribe named Tupinamba, they devoured or ate a Catholic priest alive. Now, this act created a huge wave of horror through Portugal and Spain. And it is from this event that the very term cannibal came out. Cannibal was associated with America, originally referring to the group of people in the Caribbean islands. And it entered the English language sometime in 1796, the meaning of which was an eater of human flesh. And later it was passed on into other European languages. Now, the name of the tribe and the name given to savage people who ate human flesh got fused into one single term, and people from the Caribs eating flesh were then on called as cannibals. Now, the eating of a priest was not an illogical act from the part of the tribe, because in some tribes they had this belief or practice of devouring their strongest enemy or their most worthy elders in order to acquire powers that they had wielded in life. So, of course, for Tupinamba tribe, the priest was seeking to convert them into Christianity, a religion which rests on the symbolism of devouring the blood and body of Christ. So, from their part, this act was not as bad as the world saw it. Now, the entire essay is laid on certain premises about translation. First, translation does not happen in a vacuum. It is a continuum. It's a continuation. Translation is a continuation of writing. It's not an isolated act. It's an ongoing process which involves intercultural transfer. Now, however, translation is highly manipulative activity that involves all kinds of stages in that process of transfer across the linguistic and cultural boundaries. So, when Bassnett and Trivedi talks about the manipulative activity, it is of a positive kind, wherein different actions are put into different kinds of stages in translation, which means translation is not innocent. Translation activity is not transparent. It is highly political. So that is the meaning of manipulative. When they say that translation is highly manipulative, translation is highly political. It's not an innocent act. It involves a relationship of, it rarely involves a relationship of equality between text, authors, and systems. Now, the recent works in translation studies had challenged the long-standing notion of translation as inferior to the original. Now, that is a major change that came in the field of translation, because till then it was believed that the relationship between the text, the original text, the source text, and the target text were that of a superior and a subordinate, where the original text dominated over the translated text. So there was a time when original was perceived as de facto or superior to the translation. It's also significant that the invention of the idea of original coincides with the period of early colonial expansion, when Europe began to reach outside its boundaries for territory to appropriate. So, this very concept of original came about in the colonial period, wherein most of the original texts written in English from Europe were considered to be the original texts, and their translations into the Occidental languages were considered as quite inferior. Now, today, increasingly, assumptions about the powerful original have been questioned, and a major source of that challenge comes from the domains of fearsome cannibals. Cannibals or the post colonial countries. And thus, today there is a fit between, or there is a struggle between the original and the translated text. Now, Octavio Paz claims that translation is the principal means we have of understanding the world we live in. He says that through translation, the world presented to us is in a growing heap of text, which is slightly different from one another, and he believes that it is always translations of translations of translation. So the world around you is made up of heap of texts, and when we say text, it means everything around you has a particular reading, and that reading comes from another reading, and that comes from another reading. So life is full of translations, of even more translations. Every text is unique, and at the same time, every translation is also unique. No text can be completely original because language itself, in its very essence, is already a translation. First from the non-verbal world, then because each sign and each phrase is a translation of another sign, another phrase. So exactly what Sazur would tell us. The signifier and the signified is not always fixed. It keeps on changing. So instead of imitation, instead of saying that you know the language is ambiguous, here the authors tell us that it can also be called as a translation of, so one sign and one signified can be a translation or another version. So here translation means another version. So everything around you are versions, and there is nothing called as an original. Now this radical view of translation being looked upon as a version, as a variant, as a variety, which sees it not as a marginal activity but as a primary one. And Fentis has gone so far to say that, another philosopher, that originality is a sickness. The sickness of a modernity that is always aspiring to see itself as something new. So originality is a sickness that we have in our minds. There's nothing called as original. It is a colonial concept to keep the European ideology in power. So there's nothing called as an original. Everything is a variant of another. Every text around you is a variant of another. It's a translation of another translation. Now, another example that Bassnett and Trivedi cites here is Vincent Raphael's description about the different significance the translation had for the Spanish colonizers and the Tagalog people of Philippines. Now for the Spaniards, or for the Spanish people, translation was always a matter of reducing the native language and culture to accessible objects and subjects of divine and imperial intervention. So for the Spanish people, translating the Filipinos or the people of the Tagalog community was indirectly a way of reducing their native language. considering them as not cultured, as uncultured, as savages. And when the native texts of these tribes of Philippines was translated into Spanish, that is when that text suddenly got importance or power. So for the Tagalogs, translation was a process of um, internalizing colonial Christian conventions. So it was translation was two different things for two type of people. For the colonizer, translation was stepping down, or it was dominating of the native language. But for the colonized, translation was an act of forcing them to internalize colonial Christian conventions. So he pinpoints that the different meaning that translation held for different groups of people in the colonization process was different. Thus, this is why Bassnett and Trivedi says that translation is not an innocent process. It is a political process, just like how Spivak says the same thing. Translation is political. It is different for different groups of people in the colonial and the post-colonial era. Thus, we also know that colonialism and translation went hand in hand, and that translation was the central act of European colonization and imperialism in America. So that was one way. That there were many other ways that colonization was propagated forward, but one of such, or one of the process through which colonization was kept alive, was translating the colonized group or colonized country's literature into the colonizer's language, or the other way around, creating Calibans, creating people or forcing people who they colonized to learn the language of the colonizer. So all these are interdependent activities. To translate the colonized into the colonizer's language, forcing them to learn the colonizer's language, forcing them to accept the colonizer's religion, all these were different ways of propagating colonization. Now, Tejaswini Niranjana, another translation theorist, goes one step further and suggests that translation both shapes and takes shape within the asymmetrical relations of power that operate under colonialism. So she, like Spivak, says that translation is related to power. It shapes the asymmetrical relation of power in colonization. For example, the figure of the Melange, a Native American woman who was taken as a mistress of one of the colonizers, of one of the Spanish colonizers, serves as an icon to remind us that a dominant metaphor of colonialism was that of rape, of husbanding virgin lands, tilling them, fertilizing them, and hence civilizing them. So this colonizer did this on the people, and they also raped the land from its goodness. So in the post-colonial period, like Salman Rushdie says, the empire now starts to write back. The empire starts to write back against this act of rape that colonialism did to the colonized people, the natives, and also to their land. Thus, today, translation is full of radical concepts of writing back. It majorly emerges from India, Latin America, Canada, Ireland, all um, former European colonies. So, in short, from the former colonies around the world, the challenge established European norms about what translation is and what it signifies. For Europe, the translations of Europe, which was supposed to be the duplicate, was taken up as the empire writes back. Thus, in the colo- in the era of colonization, translations were evaluated as less to originals, whereas in the post-colonial era, translation is looked upon as a completely different form of art. Translation is considered to be political. Translation is different for different groups of people, and of course, translation is a sign that empire has slowly started to write back. Thus, when Sir William Jones translated the Sanskrit romantic play, this play, which was later um, translated as Sakuntala or The Fatal Ring, was a major departure he made from the original. There were so many different cultural uh, cuttings that were done, manipulations that were done. And one of that was to stop the tender, love-lorn heroine Shakuntala from breaking into sweat every now and then. So, Apjnana Shakuntalam had, in the translation, in the English translation, had the heroine breaking into sweat each time she saw the hero. Now, having lived in Calcutta as a judge of the Supreme Court, he could not have noticed that the climate was appreciably warmer, but he still felt obliged, to take the interest of the Western notion of aesthetic into being. The problem here is that of the bodily function of sweating. For Indians, and in Kama Sutra, we have sweat, which is a symptom of sexual interest and arousal. In contrast with England, where one sweats when one is hot, ill, afraid, or working hard. And that is why we have the English euphemism: while horses sweat and men perspire, women glow. So, this act of translating many Occidental texts into English language by major English translators, it is today understood that such translations from the Occidental text into English, the very act of translation had been very political. The act of translation was an act of violence. The act of translation was cutting, editing, and putting down the artistic skills of the Occident artists, writers, poets, and by positioning English as a dominant language and all the other languages as um, inferior languages. The major belief was that only when an Occidental text was translated into English that it became a piece of art. It is throughout this period that Indian literary space was vigorously contested. There were many dozens of translations of text into Hindi in the 1920s and 30s of Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. There was translations of translations, and several of these translations were strongly modified Indian adaptations. Multiple translations into Hindi of Edward Fitzgerald's Omar Khayyam may have underlined the condition of colonial dependence in which Indians now gained access to Persian literature through English. So that was an advantage of translation. Because English was then an official language in the colonized India, one way of the educated realm of people, one way that they could get access to other literatures was to translate them into English. But on the other hand, we could also see that there were successful translations such as Madhushala, the House of Wine, by the most romantic poet in Hindi, Harivansh Rai Bachchan. It was a wholesale appropriation of Rubaiyat to the local, cultural, and even topical nationalist context. So, if Bachchan's Madhushala is at all a translation, it is translation as a rewriting or translation as a new writing of Rubaiyat, completely different from Edward Fitzgerald's translation of Omar Khayyam. Because Bachchan's translation of Omar Khayyam was fixed into the Indian literary context. Rubaiyat, written by Omar Khayyam, had an Indian background in Bachchan's Madhushala, whereas in Fitzgerald's Rubaiyat, you could see a European background. So, thus, bassnett and Trivedi borrows Sujit Mukherjee's idea of translation as rewriting or translation as new writing. When the text is translated into a new culture, it gets a new backdrop and the meanings do change there. And that is why Spivak pleads that a translator should adopt a text with love and surrender completely to the original, if I might say, or to the source text. So, as a conclusion, the last part of the essay, Bassnett and Trivedi gives an outstanding example of the Ramayana and its various translations. They pinpoint Tulsidasa's translation and his rewriting of Ramayana. Now, he was a poetic genius and he was a Brahmin by birth. And even as he brought the scriptural epic to the vernacular masses by releasing it from the custody of Sanskrit Pandits, his reformational act of the translation of Ramayana could then be called as an instance of Brazilian cannibalism, because it was like devouring the power of the Sanskrit Pandits. It marked rather a natural process of organic, ramifying, vegetative growth and renewal of the entire act could be compared of how the Brazilian cannibals devoured the Catholic priest who came to convert them into Christianity. So, thus forms a new term which is called as transcreation. Transcreation is thus a symbiotic intermingling of the original with the translation, of the tradition with the individual genius, and of the perfect mix of both the source text into the culture and language of the target language. So thus transcreation was no longer an inferior creation, but it stood at par with the source text, with the original text. And transcreations were a product of this Brazilian cannibalism, if we could say symbolically, of eating up, devouring the very European colonization that once saw these Occidental texts as inferior to the English texts. Thus, to conclude, we can see how Bassnett and Trivedi actually praises A.K. Ramanujan, and they assert that he is one of the biggest translators of that India has seen, a great Indian translator, showing how Ramanujan voiced the idea that the task of a translator was to translate the foreign reader into a native one. Because till then, the opposite was happening. The native text or the native writer was being translated into the foreign culture. So Ramanujan was the first translator to say that to translate, or a translator's role was to translate the foreign reader into a native one, and argues that Ramanujan's work effectively demonstrates the Eurocentrism of Walter Benjamin's and Derrida's theories of translation. So thus Ramanujan offers an alternative Indian translation poetics. And thus we are forced to think, or we are made aware of, the unequal power relations that happens when in the transfer of text across cultures during translation. So the translation theorist Bassnett and Trivedi reminds the readers that translation is never innocent. There is a lot of unequal power relations that is involved in the transfer of text from one culture to another, from one language to another. So cannibalism, which was once the ultimate taboo of European Christians, can now be put into a new perspective, and the point of view of the practitioners of cannibalism can be put through the medium of translation.